The Battle of Shuja'iyya occurred between the Israel Defense Forces, the Hamas military wing, and the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades. On 20 July 2014, during 2014 Israel-Gaza conflict in the Shuja'iyya neighborhood of Gaza City, in the Gaza Strip, Shuja'iyya, with 92,000 people in 6 square kilometers, is one of the most densely populated areas of the Gaza Strip. According to the IDF, it had become a terrorist fortress that between 8 and 20 July had fired over 140 rockets into Israel after the outbreak of hostilities. The casualty figures are not known with precision, also because bodies were recovered much later, and people died of injuries afterwards. The UN Protection Cluster states that between the 1920s, 55 civilians, including 19 children and 14 women, as a result of the IDF's actions. At the time they varied from 66 to about 120 Palestinians killed, with a third of them women and children, and at least 288 wounded. The UN. The figures of Palestinian casualties are preliminary and subject to revision. 13 Israeli soldiers were killed and 56 wounded. On 16 July, Israeli forces dropped by means of leaflets, loudspeaker announcements, telephone calls, text messages and radio messages, told the residents to leave and relocate in central Gaza City until further notice. Residents interviewed afterwards by The Independent claimed lack of safe refuges and the difficulty of fleeing as reasons for staying put. By 19 July, OCHA reported that while the majority had not left their homes, and ignored the warnings, up to half had gone as bombardments intensified. Israel condemned Hamas for using human shields. According to Amnesty International, the UNRWA shelter facilities were overflowing and many of the residents had nowhere to go. Residents interviewed later also cited confusion due of lack of electricity and communications. The official Israeli view was that Hamas had compelled residents of Shuja'iyya to stay behind in the face of IDF warnings to evacuate prior to the IDF assault, holding civilians as hostages. Jordanian-Palestinian politician Muda Zaran wrote that a Gaza medical worker had told him, Hamas militants blocked exits, shot people as they were running and forced the rest to return to their homes and get bombed. The assault on Shuja'iyya, involving a combination of F-16, tank and mortar fire, began at 11 p.m. on 19 July. Initially the attack, led by the Golani Brigade, encountered little resistance, until late on Saturday Hamas units emerged from tunnels, engaged and put up stiff resistance, surprising the Israelis with their tenacity and effectiveness in taking on armored units. According to Israeli military and intelligence sources, Israel then made use of heavy aerial bombardment and artillery fire, in what was described as a risky and unusual step to save Israeli soldiers' lives, and a battle against the hub of Hamas terror infrastructure, primarily the so-called terror tunnels. Palestinians attempting to flee the area described the scene as a massacre, as did Mahmoud Abbas, Richard Fall, Norwegian physician Dr. Mads Gilbert and journalist Sharif Abdelkoudais in The Nation. 101-ton bombs were dropped on the neighborhood. The conclusion of U.S. military experts interviewed by Mark Perry was that the IDF did not target Hamas sites specifically, simply to collapse Hamas tunnels, but rather laid down a walking barrage to crater the neighborhood, instead of using suppressive fire to protect their forward troops, a strategy they deemed indefensible. The operation was condemned internationally, with UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon calling it an atrocious action, and the European Union stating that it is particularly appalled by the human cost of the Israeli military operation in Shuja'iyya, while also criticizing Hamas calls for using human shields. Build up. On Wednesday, 16 July, Israeli forces dropped leaflets and delivered warnings by phone and text that residents in the Zaytun and Shuja'iyya areas of Gaza City should evacuate ahead of planned strikes. Hamas had told the civilians to stay put, which were prompted by fears of psychological warfare and perhaps a desire to avoid panic. On Thursday, Israel began what it thought of as a limited operation, involving the Nahal, paratrooper, and Givati brigades, in the Shuja'iyya area's sparsely populated eastern periphery, intent on uncovering Hamas's tunnel system. In the face of stiff resistance over the following 2 days, the probing advance developed into a full-scale battle in Shuja'iyya and the surrounding areas, as the IDF suffered upwards of 56 casualties. In Ben White's reconstruction of the background, the day after flyers were dropped, Yedioth Ahronoth's military analyst, Alex Fishman, noted that an order had been given to the tank units advancing the assault to open fire at anything that moved, and a military spokesman declared that Israel was taking off the gloves in Shuja'iyya. On Saturday night, the Golani Brigade was sent in with armored battalions into the densely populated heart of Shuja'iyya, and suffered heavy casualties. And only then did Israel decide to increase the intensity of its firepower, resulting in the steep rise in Palestinian civilian casualties. As commanders envisaged a repeat of Dahiya tactics used in Dariyah in Beirut, Lebanon, were resistance to continue. A local Gazan woman, returning to the ruins of her home in the neighborhood, made the same comparison. As a result of the onslaught, 670 buildings in Shuja'iyya were completely destroyed, 608 were severely damaged, 576 moderately damaged, and over 1,800 buildings were affected. Battle. Shuja'iyya is a densely populated area of the city with 92,000 residents according to Amnesty International. The UNRWA shelter facilities were overflowing and many of the residents had nowhere to go. The assault on Shuja'iyya, involving a combination of F-16, tank and mortar fire, began at 11 p.m. on the 19th of July. After midnight, on Sunday the 20th of July, Israeli forces entered the neighborhood, stating that over 140 rockets had been fired at Israel from the neighborhood since the 8th of July. Flyers had been dropped over the neighborhood, urging residents to flee. Some families, such as that of Khalil Atish, speak of being alerted in Arabic by the IDF to evacuate, but dismissed the message as a prank. Fleeing, as did his son, Tamer, and his family and neighbors, was difficult since Israel had destroyed all the electricity towers and the area was shrouded in darkness which had to be traversed under withering fire by the use of cell phone flashlights. An unnamed American military officer told Al Jazeera that, according to Pentagon reports of the IDF's actions on the 21st, some 258 artillery pieces deployed by 11 Israeli artillery battalions fired around 7,000 high-explosive shells into Shuja'iyya, including 4,800 shells in a 7-hour period. Initially the attack, led by the Golani Brigade, encountered little resistance, until late on Saturday Hamas units emerged from tunnels, engaged and put up stiff resistance, surprising the Israelis with their capacity to take on armored units. A 7-hour battle ensued as IDF forces battled Hamas squads, sniper units and teams carrying lethal anti-tank rockets, armed with anti-tank missiles, rocket-propelled grenades, and automatic weapons. With IDF soldiers subjected to such heavy fire, commanders ordered the troops into their protected Neymar armored personnel carriers and called in artillery strikes within 100 meters of IDF positions, closer than the 250 meters normally considered safe. An IDF officer told Haaretz that troops were taking fire from all sides and they couldn't neutralize the threat with all the firepower we gave them, leading the IDF to use its artillery, a decision Haaretz described as extremely risky and unusual. Early on the 20th of July, at approximately 1:30 a.m., the IDF suffered 13 fatalities over an 8-hour period. 7 in an armored personnel carrier which was blown up when a Hamas sapper squad managed to explode an anti-tank mine underneath it. Hamas said it captured an IDF soldier they identified as Aaron Shaul during the fighting on Sunday. IDF later confirmed that the body of Aaron Shaul, one of the 7 soldiers in the armored vehicle, had not been identified. The IDF later officially changed his status from missing in action to killed in action, although his body had not yet been recovered. Early on Sunday morning, commanders gave the order to take the gloves off and fire at anything that moves. The IDF's response was 6 hours of intensive shelling, the reason given being to rescue missing soldiers. A paramedic at a local call center said more than 200 calls for help in the period, one from virtually every house in an Aziz Street, Asharath Street, and Al-Beltaji Street, with children's screams audible in the background. Commenting on the intensity of the firepower, perhaps due to the loss of Israeli soldiers, Tamer Atish later recalled, "The F-16s were no longer up in the sky bombing us, they were flying just above the houses." Tamer recalled, "It felt like an atomic bomb with 4 F-16s coming one way and another 4 from the opposite direction, weaving between the houses. At this point, we realized we were not surviving. We said our last prayers, and that was it. Because we know that when the Israelis lose one of their soldiers they become lunatics. We just knew they had suffered something. We could sense it." About 600 shells were fired by several artillery battalions as Israeli Air Force planes bombed from above. The IAF dropped about 101-ton bombs about 250 meters away from IDF ground troops the following day in a broad aerial attack. The IDF sources reported that the tactics used prevented significant additional Israeli casualties and that the battle resulted in the IDF changing the rules of engagement to allow the use of artillery in urban areas. Witnesses interviewed by Max Blumenthal testified observing people jumping from 4th-floor stories as flames engulfed their houses and of men stripping off clothes to cover near-naked women, fleeing the scene. Several residential blocks were extensively shelled, destroying dozens of houses. Palestinians attempting to flee the area described the scene as a massacre, as did the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, Richard Falk, Norwegian Dr. Mads Gilbert and journalist Sharif Abdelkoudes in The Nation. Hundreds of civilians were injured during the unpredictable combination of artillery shelling and airstrikes overnight and only began to leave the area at dawn, many to seek refuge at the Al-Shifa hospital. 2 paramedics died during attempts to enter the area and assist the wounded, and Médecins Sans Frontières complained that its post-operative clinic in Gaza City was running at 10 to 30% of capacity due to the intensity of the bombing, which hindered patients from reaching the center. Incidents. Al-Hello family. At 3 a.m., 2 missiles struck the 3rd floor of 3-story home of Talal Mahmoud Hamd Al-Hello in Nasser Street. The family was on the 2nd floor. His brother Jihad Mahmoud Al-Hello, next door, phoned to ask after them. Shortly afterwards, Jihad's house was struck by 2 missiles and all his Al-Hello family members, 11 people including 4 children, were killed. The 3-story house was totally destroyed. The surviving brother said no warning had been received, unless the rocket hitting his house was a roof-knocking missile. If so, he claimed, the warning was not sufficient to allow them to flee in safety. AYYAD family. At 6:30 a.m., artillery shelling killed 11 members of the AYYAD family and relatives they were hosting, as they were leaving their home on Al-Mansoura Street, Shuja'iyya, as they left their home to escape the shelling. The area where their house was located had been subjected to shelling since 1 a.m., leaving the family in a state of total panic. As they made their way, some 70 meters down the road, a shell hit the house's entrance, and 2 follow-up rounds struck the group of 11 people, which included 4 children and 5 women, 1 pregnant. A further 7 persons were wounded, including 3 children and 1 woman. Ambulances could not reach them because of the continual IF aerial bombing. One survivor said no warnings had been given. Had they been messaged to that effect, the women would have been evacuated, he said. The munitions were probably 155 mm high explosive artillery shells, exploding just above ground level, the UN Commission concluded. Al-Jamal and al-Sheikh Khalil families. Israeli forces launched an attack in Baltaji Street. The al-Sheikh Khalil family stayed inside their home on the street. One witness said at 6 a.m., explosions rang outside, and mortars had struck the roof. The family relocated to the stairwell, and called the Red Cross for help. When ambulances arrived, they too were hit by mortars, and the family could not exist. 6 members were killed, 2 children and 4 women, and another 2 children seriously wounded. 4 died while waiting 6 hours for another ambulance to arrive. At 7 a.m., 47 members of the Al-Jamal family fled their home in Tawfiq Street. During the assaults, 4 members of the Al-Jamal, 3 aged between 10 and 12, were killed, and another 7, including 2 children and 4 women, were wounded while attempting to flee Shuja'iyya. Ceasefire. Sometime after dawn, a 1-hour ceasefire was brokered, but the International Committee of the Red Cross proved unable to evacuate those trapped in the area. According to a witness interviewed by the UNHRC, there was a 2-hour ceasefire, but the family still had to wait for 6 hours before ambulances arrived at the scene. About 7 a.m., a military medical aid ambulance was directly struck twice while trying to succor casualties. Of the 4 persons occupants, a driver, a photographer and 2 paramedics, 2 were killed, and 2 wounded. 2 of them were killed and 2 injured. Israel's Golani Brigade positioned itself on the outskirts, in Home east of the main Shuja'iyya mosque. According to Max Blumenthal, maps discovered later indicated the broad swathe of land where apartments were flattened beyond these houses was defined as a soccer field. According to one survivor, Muhammad Fathi al-Ariya, bullet casings found near the bodies of 4 of his brothers, one mentally disabled, who were killed in houses east of the soccer field, suggested they were executed. His neighbors, the Shamali family, stayed behind to protect their valuable retail clothing stock, and, according to a son, Heshim Naso Shamali, his father was shot as he tried to speak to approaching soldiers in Hebrew, as was his uncle and aunt, and 2 cousins. His father survived, but a cousin, Salem Shamali, a grocer at the local market who attempted to find missing family by returning to the neighborhood during the 2-hour ceasefire at 3:30 p.m. that day, was shot 3 times, while calling out the names of family members. After crossing the imaginary red line, Israeli soldiers are reported to have drawn to kill anyone coming close to their positions. He was injured by the first shot and fell to the ground, and killed when a further 2 shots were fired into him. The New York Times reported, however, that the gunman's identity is unknown. The incident was caught on film by members of the International Solidarity Movement accompanying him, and posted on YouTube. According to a former IDF sergeant-turned-activist, Aaron Efrata, who has stated he took testimony from 3 Israeli soldiers present at the scene. A sniper asked his commandant 3 times if it was okay to shoot Shamali, and was given permission when the latter stepped beyond the line. The soldiers felt guilty, Efrata added, about the death of a man who had posed no threat to their lives. Channel 4 stated it has been unable to independently verify the video or Mr. Efrati's claims. One instance of soldiers looting a house in Shuja'iyya, including $605 for partying after the war, led to an indictment in Israel. Casualties: at least 65 Palestinians, including at least 17 children, 14 women and 4 elderly were killed and 288 Palestinians were wounded, according to Shifa Hospital's director, Nasser Tatar. The United Nations is of Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People put the estimate at over 70 Palestinian dead. Other reports claim 120 Palestinians killed, 1/3 women and children. According to the spokesman for the Palestinian Ministry of Health, Ashraf al-Qidra, rescue teams retrieved more than 80 dead bodies from houses destroyed in Shuja'iyya, 17 of which were children, 14 women and 4 elderly people. Hamas said it captured an Israeli soldier. 13 IDF soldiers were killed, including 2 Americans serving in Israel. 7 of the IDF soldiers were killed as their armored vehicle was hit by an anti-tank rocket or improvised explosive device. 3 were killed in clashes with militants, and 3 were trapped in a burning house. In the following 24 hours, 3 additional IDF soldiers were killed in Shuja'iyya. Shortly after the battle, Hamas is reported to have shot 20 civilians from Shuja'iyya for protesting against Hamas for the massive destruction inflicted on their neighborhood by the IDF. Hamas said it had executed spies in the area. Unexploded Israeli ordnance left over from the bombing exploded in late September, killing a further 2 young men, Ayman Ziad Abu Jibr and Abdullah Jibril Abu Azer, and wounding 3 in Shuja'iyya.